Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first official podcast for the Meishan Pig for the American Meishan Breeders Association, the Meishan Edge, highlighting the unique advantages of the Meishan Pig. I am Laura Jensen. Excuse me. I'm the president of the American Meishan Breeders Association. I'm here with our co-host, Jonathan Kemmerer. Want to say hey?
Hello.
And then we have a special guest today. I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Max Rothschild with us today.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, good. Good to have everybody here. I think we're all kind of frozen in different parts of the country with what we got going on. So, it's bad when Atlanta is at zero. So, all right. Well, let's jump on in. So, what we want to start with today is kind of laying some of the groundwork with questions that we get through the association about the Meishan pig. Now, Max was on an interview with our YouTube channel. It was early last year, Max. Was that right?
About a year ago.
Yeah, yeah, so you can look that up. But we're going to talk about some of the same things and some of it that's a little bit different with that as well. So I'd like to jump in and just go ahead and let Max kind of tell everybody, if you would, your background and your life's work and your kind of how you're related to the Meishan.
Well, thanks very much, Laura and Jonathan. I appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast. And this is an exciting subject for me because in 1982, a long time ago, I saw my first Meishan pig. I had read about them as a student and and was quite interested in them. So my background is I'm trained as an animal geneticist. I do both quantitative genetics and genomics, and for since really almost 50 years now, I've been interested in genetics and genomics of pigs. And one of the important aspects of that has been my involvement with the Meishan breed. So in 1980, I joined the faculty at Iowa State University as an assistant professor. And by 1982, I went to my first really big foreign trip to China, where I lectured on pig breeding subjects for about 3 weeks. And while I was there, I got the opportunity to see the pig everyone had talked about, the Meishan, which was known to be a highly prolific breed. And I was quite interested in that. And from there, I went on to help arrange with two other groups the importation of Meishan pigs into the United States in 1989. So let me just, if you don't mind, I'll give you just a little background of the breed, and then I'll let you ask some questions.
Okay.
So pigs were domesticated some 8 to 10,000 years ago. That's a debatable issue. But one of the sites of domestication was Asia. And Asian style pigs with big bellies and sloped backs and big ears, were amongst the first to be domesticated. China has a long culture of the pig being an important family member. And in fact, the Chinese figure for or a symbol for house includes a pig under it. And Meishans come from the region, the Taihu region of China, the area of rivers and lakes. And their parent breed, if you like, was a breed called the Urwalian. There's also a third breed, the Fenjing, which is highly prolific and looks a lot like the Meishans, not exactly the same, smaller, no white, different wrinkle pattern, and we can come back to that in a moment. And that breed, these three breeds are from the region, and they were known to be highly prolific. And sometime in the 1700s, some Chinese germplasm got into Europe. And of course, the importation of Meishan pigs was first done in France and in the UK in the early 80s, sometime around 1983, and then into the US in 1989. And I headed up the organization and research efforts at Iowa State University. So that's a little background for your listeners.
Thank you very much. It actually raised a question I'd like to ask. I'm just going to throw it out there because I think this is one that could be controversial to other people, other breeds. Based on what you're talking about how long the pigs have been recognized in Asia, does it mean that the Meishan is potentially one of the oldest breeds in the world? Rico had found something that suggested they were 5,000 years old. That's Rico Silvera, the founder. Do you think that could be true?
You know, that all depends on how people define a breed.
Okay.
So in modern terms, we define a breed as a group of animals that have been bred to have similar uh, phenotypic or characteristics that make them look alike, and are somewhat inbred, so they have similar genetic characteristics and they carry the same genes. So it's likely that highly prolific pigs, like the Meishan or maybe the progenitor breed, the Orwellian, that yes, they were probably started to be take form 5,000 years ago. But nobody perhaps called them a breed until more recently. The modern age of breeds started with Robert Bakewell, a famous British fellow who started developing breeds in England in the 1700s. So lots of us consider that breed development goes well much earlier than that, but we kind of we tip our hat to him as the modern founder of so-called breed technology, because he laid out the rules. He said find animals that look alike, breed them together, throw out the ones that aren't similar, and then once you have that group, maintain breed purity by not letting other animals into the pedigrees. So that's kind of the modern breed technology, the development of a breed, and we're still having people develop breeds. So they may cross two breeds and then do what's called intersay mating, many generations of that to fix certain characteristics. And once those are fixed, they declare it a breed.
That is very, very interesting.
Well, and what I like to talk about with people, and I'd like to hear Max's kind of thoughts on this, is that the Meishan is really what people call like a land race or an autochthonous. That what you're talking about in the history of breeds is, like you said, a very modern Western conception. But that didn't mean that before then pigs didn't have a consistent typicity. It's just that that typicity and that sort of genetic isolation happened through like physical isolation, just not bringing in other genetics of pigs. And it didn't have the level of standardization that you have in an actual breed with a written standard.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jonathan. I don't use the term landrace very often. It's just not one that I think about a lot. But when we talk about land races, we don't talk about the landrace breed, which gets
Right.
confusing in pigs,
Yeah.
but which is a big white breed. But when we talk about land races, we're talking about local entities of animals that, again, fit a very similar phenotype. They look alike. They generally have been kept by producers, farmers, breeders, whatever term we want to use, and it may not be totally close to other individuals, but relatively so. And those land races have formed generally around some artificial selection by humans and environmental selection or natural selection. Particularly in places like Africa and Asia, where these breeds may fit certain characteristics that are desired, heat resistant, more drought tolerant in some of the ruminant species. Uh, those land races are very important. And they've tended to take the name breeds now as people go to protect them. And then we use other terms like endangered breeds to really mean endangered animals of a certain type, or heritage breeds, which suggest there are heritage. They may in some case be, but it's a little hard to, in my mind, to call a Chinese pig in America a heritage breed. It's a special breed. It wasn't part of the heritage of pig breeds in the Americas. But all these terms are useful. A lot of times, if you want to look at it from a Western standpoint, breeds didn't become breeds until somebody uh, put a financial value on them and went to protect them. And then they became breeds, breed associations, breed societies, and those formed the basis for the intervention that we now know when we call something a breed. We ask people to register their animals and do other activities together.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's an important distinguishing or an important way of distinguishing it, I think, because in that Chinese text that I have that we've worked on translating, it talks about how the Meishan was referred to in writings that go back over 500 years, that it was listed as basically on the list of tributes, things that you would buy for the king or emperor or whatever. And so it's a population of pigs that has, a named population of pigs that goes back over 500 years. But like you said, without that, standard and criteria, it's not entirely correct to call it a breed, because even that same text explains that, in different parts of the Taihu, they had different sizes, different maternal traits. They
E-
weren't all that consistent, even though they were a named population.
Exactly. And while they have some physical characteristics that were similar, there were certain subgroups of Meishans that were smaller or larger. The saying that the Chinese told us while we were in China picking the pigs is, if you look at a Meishan head on, it should have a certain set of wrinkles that basically say its name. I don't speak Chinese. My Chinese character recognition isn't that good, so I couldn't swear by that. But people told me that when I was in China.
You see it a little because there's three characters, and it's actually really interesting. I don't know a lot about how the Chinese language works, but the three characters that make Meishan pig, the first one is plum, the second one is mountain, and the third one is pig. And the middle one, it has sort of like a three-prong fork kind of shape.
Yeah.
And then the characters on either side are a little bit more complicated.
And that's why it's important, if you want to make an argument that we could probably talk about for a while. If we're selecting Meishan pigs, we don't want to select against the wrinkles, for instance.
Mhm.
In the importation of Shar-Pei dogs from China, again, from the same region, apparently, one of the ways some people have tried to explain why in this region are there wrinkled dogs, are there wrinkled pigs, and the explanation is more skin creates more wrinkles, creates more surface area that allows heat to be dissipated. And when American breeders got the Shar-Pei, they noticed that they had occasionally skin issues with the wrinkles. They didn't get their dogs clean enough in between the wrinkles, and so they bred the wrinkles out of the dog. And it's like, why? It doesn't make any sense, because that was a distinguishing characteristic of the breed.
Something I would like to focus on in a podcast is that alone. Like we've talked about it, we have different body types, and the different documents we found support that. And I'd love to talk that through about the different options and kind of where do we need to go, as we know we don't have a breed standard. What does that look like, and things of that nature. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I think, you, you have a kind of a de facto breed standard. The question is whether you want to characterize that more clearly.
Yeah, the breed description I think is excellent. But as the hogs go into more show rings, of course, there's a push to make it more of a standard than a description, and that's a hard one for me. But again, I think that's kind of its own podcast, really, its own conversation there.
And we can certainly talk about that sometime in the
I'd love that.
future.
Okay, great.
But so that's the background. The pigs were imported in 1989, along with two other breeds, the Fenjing from the same region, and the Min, or the Minzu, as some people called it, which makes no sense because Zhu is the Chinese word for pig. So the Min, and the Min is from the northern part of China, near Harbin, has very long hair, and if you have a very fancy hairbrush with natural pig bristles that was made in China, it's likely from that breed, for instance.
Interesting.
And they were selected. We brought them here to Iowa thinking they could withstand the cold. They do a great job with the cold. All the other pigs would be in straw in the buildings, and the Mins would be out on the decks in this cold weather, but they weren't nearly as prolific and therefore not nearly as interesting.
That's really interesting. I'd like to clarify or educate everybody listening. There's two terms that are used in pigs, and it's genotype and phenotype. And I know we use them, and we know what we're referring to. But Max, would you break that down and share what's the difference between a genotype and a phenotype?
Sure. So the phenotype is the what you see on the animal. So it might be long ears, swaying belly, number of teats,
Socks.
color of the skin, color of the white socks in the Meishan pig. That's the phenotype. The genotype is, and the phenotype we think of as a black box. We need to know what's inside that black box, and inside that black box are the genes on the chromosomes. The genes are made up of the DNA, and the genes form in groups, form the genotypes. What are the genes behind each of the traits? What makes that pig highly prolific? What makes that pig have a special meat quality, and so on? What makes it grow fast? That's the genotype of the pigs. And uh, until we had DNA technologies, we used the measurements from the outside and some statistical methods to predict the genotype of the animal. So we might predict that the sow might have 18 pigs. The average in the breed might be 16, and we might use that information to predict that the real genetic value of that sow was 18, not 20, or whatever the case may be. Now, in the modern age, if you like, in this century, we talk about genomics. So genetics is the genetic material around heredity. Genomics is the underlying study of the actual DNA itself, the individual genes, the mutations, the alleles, the different forms of the gene. That's genomics. And that's where we're headed in the future, is using genomics to more accurately predict relationships among animals, who's the best in a certain trait, and so on.
Thank you. That's very helpful. In all your years of the Meishan, do you see that there are specific things to the Meishan that you would point out to our membership
Well,
in each of these categories?
certainly there are things known about the underlying genes for meat quality. We know they have genes that they don't grow as fast as commercial pigs might. One of the big discoveries, and I'm thankful that I was part of that, was to discover that a gene called estrogen receptor, and that's the gene that helps capture estrogen in all animals. All mammals have estrogen, especially females have a different amount of estrogen, and the receptor itself is kind of like the baseball glove that catches the molecule that's the estrogen. That the Meishan pig has a different form of the estrogen receptor that helps contribute to her having larger litters. And we discovered this in 1990, and went on to further discover that only one commercial breed, has the gene that the beneficial. They all have estrogen receptor genes, but the beneficial form, which the Meishan has, in very high frequency, it's not completely fixed, but it's in high frequency. The large white or American Yorkshire has that same form of the gene in higher frequency than some of the other breeds. And we attribute that to the fact that there's lots of writings that Chinese germplasm got into large white pigs in the late 1700s in Great Britain. So there's a good reason for that. It's not nearly as good. This gene is associated with as many as 2 pigs more per litter. Well, so one gene controlling more than 2 pigs per litter. It's really phenomenal, because the heritability of reproduction is only about 10, maybe 15%. So that means that genetic differences, if I see big genetic differences between sows, big phenotypic differences between sows, the genetic differences on average are pretty small. But in the Meishan, we know there's a single gene, the estrogen receptor, that has a favorable allele that's associated with higher litter size. And one of the easy things to do at some point in the breed would be to screen all the Meishan females and discard the ones that are either heterozygous or homozygous for the unfavorable allele.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask next. You touched on that at conference, and I had wanted to ask more, but as we know, it gets kind of crazy there. So it's not a given that the Meishan has this receptor, but it is something that could
No,
potentially be tested for.
they all have the receptor. It's not a given that they have the beneficial form
Okay.
of the gene. My guess is that they all carry at least one copy of the beneficial,
Hmm.
but we want them to be homozygous, carry two copies of the beneficial. And so when we brought pigs in, our 22 females that came to Iowa State, uh, I think we had only one animal that had no copies of the beneficial. Then we had a few that were heterozygous, and then the rest were homozygous for the beneficial. And
So kind of
when Pig Improvement Company brought theirs into their breeding herd, they found exactly the same thing.
So kind of what you're saying is that if you have a pig that is heterozygous and you breed that to another pig that's heterozygous, you could potentially create offspring that just don't have that
That's
genetic
right.
receptor. Whereas on the other hand, we could genetically test our herd and remove any pig that's heterozygous, and from then on, we would only ever have pigs that are homozygous for this
Exactly.
specific trait.
And that could be done, for argument's sake, that could be done along with doing pedigree testing or other aspects. So we could certainly do that. And as we discover additional genes in the Meishan that are associated perhaps with meat quality or other aspects, we could do that as well.
It's so interesting. So y'all know I'm not the scientist here. I'm the better marketer than the science. So what y'all are saying is if we test these hogs, or we get to the point we can test these hogs, and they have two of these genes. Am I saying that right? Or
No,
receptors?
alleles. We call them
Alleles.
alleles. They're forms of the gene.
That.
Remember, all mammals have pairs of chromosomes,
Mhm.
so that each chromosome is one copy of the gene. We want them to have beneficial on one chromosome and beneficial on the other.
All right, and then that would indicate, based on what you found in your work, that those pigs would average 2 pigs per litter
More
than
than the
more
ones
than
that had no copies of the
okay.
beneficial
Those,
allele.
okay, that's it. They had the 2 copies versus no. Okay, all right, that's really
And
interesting.
in a nutshell, that's kind of what you're doing as a pig breeder, right? You're identifying the best traits and removing the ones you don't want until you only get the ones you do want. I mean, that's pig breeding in a nutshell.
Mhm.
That is, and in the old days when all we did was look at the phenotype, we were manipulating the black box, if you like.
Yeah.
Now, as we learn specific genes, we can do that a little better. And this opens a big opportunity for Meishan breeders, members of your association, to identify, in particular, animals that have desirable characteristics, and then use those for future breeding.
Wow, from the genetic testing.
Right.
Well, certainly from genetic testing, but also from the phenotype.
Mhm.
There's nobody actively doing Meishan genomics right now in the U.S. I won't say that era is over, but it's kind of on hold because most people have moved on to something called genomic selection, and that's where you look at every gene in the genome, all the thousands of genes, and you select on average for the best score, for whether it be for reproduction or meat quality or whatever. And this would be something that breeders can indirectly do by selecting just the best phenotypes. Always select the best mothers, select daughters from the best mothers. Uh, if you have a particular group of offspring that were slaughtered and sold based on their meat, and they had particularly much better meat than the average Meishan, well, remember who the sire is and breed him then again. So these are all kinds of things we need to work through, and as people start looking at the pig not only as a way to market meat and other things, but looking at ways to improve the breed.
Well, and at the same time, also removing the ones that have qualities that you don't want, because
Yeah.
you can have a pig that doesn't perform well, you breed it to a good pig and you get an offspring that seems like a good pig. That offspring is still going to carry some of those bad traits that you don't
I,
want. And a lot of breeders talk about being really judicious, that if that pig doesn't have or has something you specifically don't want, don't even keep good offspring from them, because you're still going to have some of those
well,
bad things tucked in there.
well, that's probably true because we remember we're working on the law of averages here. Each animal passes on an average sample half of their genes. Some can get lucky and pass only good genes, and then at the other end, only bad genes. But on average, they'll pass some good, some bad. And so
Yeah.
we need to be kind of judicious of how we do this. We should never be keeping animals that don't help improve the breed. So whether it be a certain color that we want the animals to look like, a certain phenotype, or meat quality. We sold meat to customers, and some raved about this one boar's offspring. Then, hopefully we kept him or one of his sons, and we use him and see how that's passed on.
And thank you for correcting me, because that's true. It's not that they will pass on, it's just they have the potential to do that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to correct you, Jonathan. I'm just trying to say, I
Need to
think
catch
people,
it.
I think people on average, I think people forget that everything's a sample half. Now, if you
Yeah.
look at your own family, for instance, if you have kids or whatever, sometimes kids look exactly like one parent and not the other. And that may be because some of the genes associated with phenotype are dominant and they've been passed on and they're dominant. Other cases, they're additive and they look like a mix of the two parents. So, it's easy to generalize, but we don't always know which genes are passed on, and we have to be careful when we look at that. So I always tell people choose your breeding stock wisely based on what you think are some good animals.
Yeah. A couple thoughts on that. One, that's actually our next recording that you can join us, Max, is to talk about breeding, because I think there's so many topics that need to be discussed there. And I just want to share an overview of where I think the Meishan is in North America. We've come out of the critically endangered status. We've been moved up to a threatened. I personally feel like the Meishan is out there. Now, might you have to drive if you're in Montana to get stock? Yeah, you may still have to drive, but do I need to fly pigs all over the country to make sure that the pigs are out there? No. And in my opinion, now that we have that somewhat stabilized in the US, and fortunately we had a lot of great founding member breeders that cared about genetics. So they made sure that the genetic diversity happened. And now I think that we can look at breeding. We can look at maybe, line breeding and things of that nature. And like you're starting to say, Jonathan, what would you cull in your program? And I think that's one of the great things about this podcast is we can share this information, we can share where the breed is, and we can help educate, myself included, on kind of what we want to do with our programs and where we want to take the Meishan next without changing what the Meishan is.
And I think breeders in your organization have done a good job, as you say, initially with genetic diversity. I
Mm-hmm.
hope at some point we'll talk a little bit about inbreeding.
Mm-hmm.
It gets a bad rap as a in a generalized way, but it can be used both good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I just want to say, and this is an area that Jonathan, I think, knows a great deal about, and I hope he'll talk about in later podcasts, is the genetics kind of creates the potential. How you feed them, Jonathan knows a lot about feeding Meishan, and how you manage them is extremely important. We talk about genetic potential. It has to be realized. So you feed them poorly, you treat them like they shouldn't be treated, you ignore some things associated with their biology, then you've lost the genetic potential of this breed. And clearly, what your members told me when I went to the conference is that they have the potential to produce large litters. They have the potential to produce high quality meat that meets certain marketplaces. Those are things you want to maintain, and you can do that both through nutrition and through proper management.
That's raised a question that I've had in the back of my mind. Do you think the Meishan is more susceptible to the quality and timing of feed and protein and environment? Are they the same as other pigs? Are they a little tougher to get that
I
balance?
you know, every every one of the so-called heritage breeds or endangered breeds have differences in how they have been fed over time. And I think one of the things that Meishans were good at in China is that they were fed a lot more roughage, a lot more scraps. Uh, that's quite different from the modern pig, which gets a certain diet of a certain protein percent of primarily corn and soybeans, and then augmented feeds that are with additional protein added. So I'm not going to jump too deep into that because it's not my expertise.
Okay, sorry,
Clear,
sure.
clearly, some people have a lot more experience in the American situation of feeding Meishans than I do. We fed them standard feeds. They grew slower than pigs, but we expected that. I'm not sure we fed them to their best content. Certainly, you could alter the feed in Meishans and other heritage breeds to make better quality meat. And that's the thing that I hope Meishan breeders will look into in the future. Um, but they're
And
all different. I
especially,
mean, Meishans appear to be, for instance, resistant to some E. coli diseases. They're pretty susceptible to certain pneumonias. So, yes, they're susceptible to some, resistant to some, better at this, not as good at that. But that's what makes them a unique breed.
Yeah,
and
I
I think
think
what you said is really interesting there about the history and what they were traditionally raised on, what they were traditionally selected on, because I mean, we've been feeding corn and soy predominantly to pigs since what, probably the 90s when they learned how to extract the meal from the soy really well and roast it and all of that stuff. But even before then, farmers were feeding tankage and other like concentrates and high protein stuff. Whereas to me, what's always been the most interesting about the Meishans is that this kind of backyard production of pigs in China, where they were fed all these scraps, that was the way pork was predominantly produced in China through the 1980s, literally up until the point that they were imported to the US.
Yeah, when I started going to China in the 80s, I went several times to China. Probably I've been 20, 25 times in my lifetime. But when I started going to China, they were just starting to move towards corn and soybean diets because they needed those products to feed their large human population. And one of the issues was that Chinese were debating was should they buy American corn and soybeans or should they just buy American pork and import that? It would be a lot easier. Import the end product. You know, eventually they started planting more corn and soybeans and they worked that out themselves. But certainly their diets changed to late 80s, early 90s of how they fed pigs, but they also modernized their systems. They modernized their production. They took Western breeds. They reduced the number of native breeds. You know, now Meishan and these other land races in China are really used for specialty products only. They're not used for everyday consumption.
is it. I think Rico had found that the government was the only people that could own boars or pure boars over there. Was that what you found as well?
Um, yeah, I
Mm,
don't remember that. They certainly grouped the Meishans into government breeding herds,
okay.
and then more recently with the African swine fever, it's been argued. I won't say it's true, but it's been argued that the government let African swine fever get out of hand with the small breeders because the small breeders were taxing the system. They really needed just large breeders to produce pork. So a lot of small breeders were wiped out in the African swine fever uh, uh, epidemic that happened just before COVID in China. And of course, we have some problem with that now because it got out of hand as well. And it's, you know, in some parts of Europe, uh, African swine fever has been endemic in Africa, but not at the extent it is in large pork producing countries like in China.
Well, and it might be worth mentioning now that on our YouTube channel, we do have a video that I made about the history of pigs in China and specifically the Meishans. I found some really interesting texts on this subject, specifically that in the mid 1900s, across the board, the Chinese government got involved in increasing the productivity of small landholder farms, and that they definitely did take an active role in trying to improve and selectively breed the Meishans as they did, not just livestock, but crop seeds and everything like that. I don't know if it's true that they exclusively are the only ones that own them, but they definitely have like I mean, the farm that they were imported from was a big government run farm, wasn't it?
Yes. All the three breeds that we brought in were brought in from government farms. What happened was we had a group of scientists from and actually a couple of pork producers as well. In Iowa, we had a pork producer and myself. In the Illinois group had a scientist and a pork producer. The U.S. government one from USDA Mark had just two scientists, and we all went in and picked pigs, and they were all from government facilities.
A few more questions about that, if we can.
Okay.
A lot of people ask me why was the Meishan brought to the U.S. As if it was brought for like to study a Meishan and put the Meishan in the U.S. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I don't. I think that the answer was it was brought to the U.S. to study, and it was brought with the idea in mind that we would discover what made a Meishan or a Fanjing or a Min, because we brought the three breeds in and studied all three. Was were there special characteristics in these breeds that eventually could be moved into commercial pork production? That was the goal. The group at Illinois did feeding and some meats and a little genomics. Iowa State was strictly genomics and reproduction. And the group at Mark was, I would say, looked at a more typical crossbreeding system. How do I set up a crossbreeding system that can incorporate characteristics that these breeds had? To be honest, the Iowa State group was the most successful because we found the gene ESR and the beneficial allele, and that's been that technology by developing a gene test that was later patented and used in the industry. That technology remains today. The other technologies of moving Meishan genes into for better meat or higher reproduction, they failed because breeding companies, and PIC and DeKalb were the two companies that brought Meishans into their breeding herds. They weren't happy with the F1s. They weren't happy with quarter Meishans. And that's true in Europe as well. Only one company still remains with a little Meishan. Think about an eighth Meishan in it. They just weren't happy with the cross products. And
Well, they were trying to get incredibly lean pigs back then, weren't they?
they were, and we're still, from if we look at pork production, we need to think about the type of pork that's produced. We talk about commodity pork, that's the chop or the pulled pork I eat almost everywhere in the country. Uh,
Right.
that commodity pork is not going to be produced by a Meishan. And then there's the white linen pork for fancy restaurants or the pork for specialty products. And that pork is being produced by a few specialized breeds, Berkshire, Meishan, Mangalitsa. Some people like that breed. Those specialty products come from the special characteristics of the meat or the breed itself. But the wholesale idea that we could cross these, select, and move forward quickly, that just never took place.
So is the Meishan part of any of the commodity markets today from that research, or you're saying it just never really took off? They
Well,
didn't like it, therefore it's not.
indirectly it is because when we discovered at Iowa State that the one allele, the beneficial allele for estrogen receptor, we started looking at all the commodity pork breeds: Duroc, Landrace, Yorkshire, large white, Berkshire, and it only really existed in large white or Yorkshire. Now we found a few of the beneficial alleles in Landrace. That's a breed that there's some question of whether it got some large white in it indirectly at some point. And what's interesting, and what I tell people is, it's not just the gene, it's the gene and the background it's in. So that beneficial allele in Meishan is worth 2 pigs per litter. The beneficial allele in the large white breed, or in the pigs that PIC sold, was only worth about 8 or 9 tenths of a pig. And that's because the genes around it, if you like, that it interacted with or produced, they weren't as, they hadn't been selected together. So the Meishan clearly has other genes that have been selected for litter size besides estrogen receptor. But in that background, it was particularly beneficial. So as soon as we found that it was in large white, those people that had the genetic test went forward and selected it. So indirectly, what we learned improved the commodity pork litter sizes.
I think there was some interesting research at Illinois like that too, because it was who was it? Harold Stein and Pedro Uriola. They did a study on fiber in the Meishan diet because there was always interest on can these pigs not handle more roughage. And what the study found was that they can, but it has to be soluble fiber, not insoluble fiber. And that was, to my knowledge, one of the earliest studies that showed the disparity between those two. And now, I mean, Stein's lab at Illinois is kind of one of the leading labs on understanding fiber in swine diets, which is, to me, one of the most interesting advancements in swine diets since the understanding of amino acid balance.
Yeah,
We're learning.
That's exactly right. They did some very nice stuff. And what I told people is, in geneticists, we like to always talk about model species. And for a long time, people did all their initial selection experiments using mice or rats. Those were the model species. We learned we could select for growth or litter size or whatever. I told people that the Meishan's kind of like the model species in pigs, because we learned so much about, they were so different than commodity pigs and commodity breeds that we could see differences and then attribute those to individual genes or physiology or whatever, and that we could use that information then to improve the commodity pig production. And that's what's happened, whether it be in nutrition from Stein's lab in Illinois or our lab to do genomics work.
Last question, unless you have anything, Jonathan. Why did the testing end? What went on?
Well, you mean individual gene development testing?
Well, just with the Meishan in general, of course, when Rico was able to get what was the foundation herd, it was apparently because it had ended. So,
well, the university and university research is expensive, and the general feeling was that crossbreeding was not going to develop the new age pig.
Okay.
The Chinese pigs lost some interest when people had to find money to pay for those pigs or the extra cost of those pigs, because as a rule, our research farm sold pigs to commodity suppliers who sold them for meat. They didn't want the Meishan in those days. So we had to have, when we didn't have any research money, there were only limited findings, as I've discussed, and Jonathan's talked about. We had considerable pressure to basically stop those experiments. And, sadly, I would, if I was 30 years younger and I had a research lab, I think I could go back and look at some traits now that are a little more obvious to me about Meishans, because the tools, the genomic tools are better now than they were. But everything is pretty well associated with the timing and your luck, and that situation was such that we did well, but it was time to move on. As my administrator told me, find money for those pigs or move on.
Okay.
Well, could you elaborate on that? What do you think would be worth researching in the Meishans?
I think meat quality is certainly an area. I think underlying some of the genes associated with meat quality would be certainly quite interesting. I suspect there are genes that we found in others that we found in the Duroc and the Berkshire, calpostatin, and some of the other genes that we found. It'd be interesting to see if there were specialized forms of those genes in the Meishan.
Okay.
Interesting. I'd like to do a podcast on that too, if y'all wouldn't mind. You were talking
Well,
to
I don't know if
conference about what
if
makes meat red, and maybe even on like slaughter timing and things like that. I think that would be
that's fine. I'm not a meats expert, but I could point you to somebody who I'm sure would be happy to help
okay.
out.
All
That'd
right,
be great.
great, cool. All right, Jonathan, do you have anything else today for Max?
I don't think so. No, it's been
Okay,
great having you, Max. Thanks for talking
Well,
with
absolutely.
us.
it's been fun. I really enjoyed meeting people at the Meishan conference.
Yep.
I hope I didn't screw up and I get an invite back for the next one in Oregon.
Yep.
And I'm always happy to help. I've been helping with breed purity, and one of the things we didn't cover today, but I think there's certainly some opportunity to look at Meishans and make sure that there aren't any other breeds that have infiltrated. It might be a little Fenjing, or for instance, in one of the breeds. And certainly setting breed standards on phenotypes might be something to talk about in the future.
Absolutely. I agree. I've came up with, I don't know, probably 5 other podcast topics. I've been making my
Okay.
notes as we've been talking. So thank you, Max. Thank you, Jonathan. Max, you're absolutely invited back. Conference is 2026 in Oregon. It is September. We are confirming the date so we can announce, so we can start making our plans, but you'll be the first to know for sure.
Okay. Well, I've got a few things covered in September 26th, so I'll have to let you know when I'm available. But
I hope it doesn't cross.
I'd like to do that. So that sounds great fun. And I've enjoyed working with both of you, and I wish you success with the Meishans.
All right. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you guys for watching and listening. And we will see you on the next show, huh?
Okay.
Bye.
Bye bye.